The swinging doors of a Wild West saloon were never designed for dramatic entrances. They weren't a stage prop for a hero in a white hat to announce his arrival to a room full of hushed gamblers. That is the sanitized, perfumed version of history they sold you in the 1950s to make the conquest of the West look like a moral crusade. In reality, those bat-wing doors were a desperate necessity of fluid dynamics and biological survival. They were there for ventilation. Because once you crossed that threshold, the air was no longer a resource. It was a biohazard. It was a thick, stagnant suspension of ammonia, unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and the sweet, cloying scent of internal rot. The saloon was not a social club. It was a high-density infection vector. It was a terminal where the frontier's desperate labor force went to liquidate their wages in exchange for a chemical override of their miserable reality. It was the only place in town that stayed open 24 hours a day, not because of the community spirit, but because the biological machine of the frontier requires a pressure valve. And that valve was always, inevitably, coated in a thick layer of filth. The first thing you have to understand about the 1870s saloon is that it wasn't a building. It was an extraction point. In the early days of a mining camp or a railroad town, the saloon was the first organism to sprout from the mud. It didn't start with mahogany bars and crystal chandeliers. It started as a tent saloon, a canvas sheet stretched over a frame of scrap wood, sitting directly on the alkaline dust. If the town survived the first 6 months, the tent became a soddy, a structure built of earth and grass, literally a hole in the ground where men huddled together to drink in the dark. Only when the capital became stable did the false fronts go up. Those grand 2-story facades you see in movies, they were architectural lies. Behind those tall wooden walls was usually a cramped 1-story shack. It was a visual audit designed to trick the brain into believing there was stability where there was only chaos. It was a corporate mask worn by a shack to project an image of permanence in a world made of dust. The floor beneath your boots wasn't polished oak. It was rough-hewn pine, or more often, just packed dirt covered in a thick layer of sawdust. This wasn't for aesthetic charm. The sawdust was a visceral biofilter. Its job was to absorb the constant discharge of the human machine. Spilled beer, vomit, blood from a broken nose, and the incessant rhythmic stream of tobacco spit. By the end of a Saturday night, that floor was a damp, fermenting slurry of everything the human body rejects. You weren't standing in a bar. You were standing on a massive, porous sponge saturated with the pathogens of 1,000 unwashed men. This was the primordial mud of the frontier, a breeding ground for bacteria that thrived in the dark, damp heat of the room. If you ordered a whiskey in a frontier saloon, you weren't buying a drink. You were participating in a chemical assault. True, aged bourbon was a rare luxury, shipped in small quantities for the rail barons and the high-stakes gamblers who could afford the markup. For the man in the mud, the option was Rotgut, coffin varnish, or tarantula juice. And those names weren't metaphors. They were clinical descriptions of the product's effect on the human nervous system and the gastrointestinal lining. The economics of the trail didn't allow for the transport of heavy glass bottles of premium spirits across 1,000 miles of desert. Instead, the saloon keeper would buy raw, industrial-grade grain alcohol, essentially 190-proof fire, and cut it on site. To make it look like whiskey, they added burnt sugar or molasses for color. To give it the kick of aged spirits, they added a plug of chewing tobacco for a nicotine hit that spiked the heart rate. But it went deeper into the visceral dark. To simulate the burn of high-quality liquor, they added red pepper, To make it more potent for a population that was already chemically dependent, they added turpentine, ammonia, and creosote, the same toxic chemical used to preserve railroad ties. In some cases, they added strychnine in microdoses. Strychnine, in small amounts, acts as a violent stimulant. It sharpens the senses and creates an intense, artificial high, followed by a crushing, agonizing withdrawal. This was the liquid fire that fueled the frontier. It was a neurotoxic cocktail designed to bypass the brain's survival instincts and replace them with a singular, desperate craving. When you drank it, your internal organs didn't just process it, they revolted against it. It was a liquid override for a nervous system that had been ground down by 16 hours of labor. You didn't drink for the notes of caramel. You drank for the chemical blackout that allowed you to forget the mud for a few hours. The saloon was a miracle of microbial efficiency. In a world before antibiotics, before germ theory was common knowledge on the plains, the interior of a crowded bar was a high-speed highway for contagion. Think about the logistics of the unwashed. A man on the frontier might bathe once a month, if the weather was warm enough to break the ice on the creek. He carried those pathogens, lice, staph, tuberculosis, directly into the closed, smoky environment of the saloon. The most lethal part of the experience was the communal glass. Saloons didn't have running water. They didn't have sanitizing cycles. A glass was cleaned by a quick dip in a bucket of stagnant river water behind the bar. Water that had already been used to rinse 100 other glasses that day. Every sip you took was a biological exchange with every man who had stood at that bar before you. This was the true Wild West violence. Cholera didn't need a six-shooter to clear a room. Smallpox didn't need a holster. Tuberculosis thrived in the kerosene smoke and the heavy dampness of the sawdust floors. In the 1870s, you had a 50% higher chance of being liquidated by a pathogen you inhaled over a hand of poker than you did of being shot in the street. The saloon was a massive wooden petri dish, and every patron was a fresh culture for the next epidemic. It was a site of biological mathematics, where the density of the crowd was directly proportional to the speed of the next outbreak. We like to think of the saloon as a lawless free-for-all, but it was actually a highly structured environment, governed by a rigid ledger of exclusion. It was the frontier office, the central hub for the white male labor force, but the boundaries were carved in stone. It was a place for the white machine to reinforce its own biological hierarchy. A respectable woman wouldn't even walk on the same side of the street as a saloon. The air inside was considered morally and physically toxic. The only women allowed were the laborers, the saloon girls, whose job was to audit the pockets of the men. They weren't there for romance. They were there for resource extraction. They used the promise of companionship to keep the Rotgut flowing, and ensuring that the workers' wages were recycled back into the saloon's treasury as quickly as possible. It was a high-stakes psychological game of survival. And then there were the racial lines. The frontier was a melting pot, but the saloon was a filter. Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and black cowboys, who made up a huge portion of the labor force, were often barred by unwritten laws of biological hierarchy. They were forced to build their own shacks on the outskirts of town, peripheral saloons where the filth was even deeper and the liquor was even more lethal. The Main Street Saloon was a sanctuary for the dominant machine, a place where they could reinforce their standing while their livers slowly dissolved in a bath of turpentine and sugar. Forget the bar brawl. The idea of 20 men throwing chairs and crashing through tables is a cinematic fantasy. In reality, a saloon brawl was a catastrophic loss of property that no saloon keeper would tolerate. If you broke a mirror or a chair, You were paying for it with your life or your wages. The cookie or the bartender was an enforcer of the market's assets. The violence in a real saloon was quick, quiet, and mechanical. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a sudden, visceral extraction. It happened over a marked card, a spilled drink, or a perceived audit of a man's honor. The saloon was the ultimate mirror of the frontier's soul. It wasn't a place of legends. It was a place of desperation. It was a site where the human machine went to recharge its batteries with poison and pathogens. We have sanitized it because the truth is too oily, too gritty, and too dark to put on a postcard. We've turned the Rotgut into craft bourbon and the Sawdust into rustic decor. We've removed the smell of the ammonia and the sound of the tubercular cough. We've turned a biological disaster zone into a theme park. We have replaced the primordial reality of survival with the comfort of nostalgia. But the real frontier doesn't care about your nostalgia. It only cares about the math. The saloon was the ledger where the price of the West was calculated in gallons of toxic spirit and years of lost life. It was a machine for turning men into waste, one drink at a time. And the floor was always ready for the next layer of sawdust to cover the evidence. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and history is never what you think.